Welcome back to Dark Horror Stories. In today's episode, I'm sharing 9 true disturbing stories from the remote wilderness of Canada. These are tales of people who ventured into the frozen north and found something they were never meant to see. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Story 1. My uncle left me his cabin near Reindeer Lake in northern Saskatchewan. I'd only met him twice, once at a family reunion when I was 8, and once at my grandmother's funeral. He was the kind of person who preferred silence to small talk, and apparently he'd lived alone up there for almost 30 years. The lawyer said he'd specified in his will that I should spend at least one night in the place before deciding whether to sell it. Something about understanding what you're giving up. I thought that was strange, but I was 29, broke, and the cabin was paid off. Even if I sold it, that could change everything for me. The drive up took 2 days. I stopped in La Ronge to get supplies, canned soup, coffee, batteries for the flashlight. The woman at the checkout counter asked where I was heading, and when I told her, she got quiet for a second. Then she just said, "Your uncle was a good man." Kept to himself. The way she said it felt like there was more she wasn't saying, but I didn't press. The last 20 kilometers were on a logging road that hadn't been maintained in years. My sedan bottomed out twice, and I was sure I'd crack the oil pan. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by black spruce so dense you couldn't see more than a few meters into the trees. It was smaller than I'd imagined, just one room with a loft, a wood stove, and shelves lined with books about forestry and wildlife. Everything was neat, almost obsessively organized. Canned goods arranged by type, firewood stacked by size. Even his boots were placed exactly parallel to each other by the door. I spent the first few hours just cleaning and getting the stove going. The November cold came through the walls like they were made of paper. By the time the sun started to set, around 4:30 that far north, I had a decent fire going and was heating up some soup. I remember thinking the place wasn't so bad. Quiet, sure, but peaceful. I even took a photo of the sunset through the window to send to my sister, though there was no cell service. That's when I noticed the notebook on the shelf above the sink. It was leather-bound, the pages yellowed and covered in my uncle's tight handwriting. The first entry was dated 15 years ago. "First winter alone," it said, "getting used to the sounds, telling myself it's just the trees settling, the wind, animals, probably is." I flipped through a few more pages. Most entries were mundane, weather observations, notes about repairs he'd made, sightings of moose or foxes, but scattered throughout were other notes. "Heard the knocking again last night, 3 times then silence, 3 times then silence. Found tracks circling the cabin, too large for any wolf I've seen. It knows I'm here now." I closed the notebook. My hands were shaking a little, though I told myself it was just the cold. Uncle Raymond had been alone up here for decades. Maybe he'd gotten paranoid, started imagining things. That happens to people in isolation, doesn't it? I set the notebook back on the shelf and tried to focus on eating my soup, but it tasted like warm tin. The knocking started around 8 o'clock. 3 solid thumps against the back wall of the cabin, then nothing. I froze with my spoon halfway to my mouth, soup dripping back into the bowl. I waited, counting seconds in my head. When I got to 45, there were 3 more knocks, same wall, same rhythm. I told myself it was a branch hitting the cabin, even though there'd been no wind all evening, even though the sound was too deliberate, too evenly spaced. I got up and grabbed the flashlight, my heart doing something uncomfortable in my chest. The back wall faced directly into the woods. There was one small window, covered by a thin curtain my uncle had made from an old sheet. I didn't want to look. Every instinct told me to stay exactly where I was, finish my soup, and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But I thought about my uncle living here for 30 years, hearing these sounds, and I felt like I owed it to him to at least check. I pulled the curtain aside. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the tree line about 10 meters away. Nothing moved. The snow on the ground was undisturbed except for my footprints from earlier when I'd brought in more firewood. I was about to let the curtain drop when I saw it, a pale hand pressed against the outside of the window, fingers spread wide. The hand was too large, that's what my brain fixated on. The fingers were easily twice the length of mine, bone white and impossibly thin. They didn't move. They just rested there against the glass, as if whatever owned them was standing perfectly still in the darkness, waiting for me to notice. I stumbled backward and the flashlight fell from my hand, rolling across the floor and clicking off. In the sudden darkness, I heard 3 more knocks, but this time they came from the front door. I grabbed the flashlight and my keys without thinking. My uncle's notebook was still on the shelf, but I didn't care. I threw open the door, there was nothing on the front porch, and ran for my car. The engine turned over on the second try, and I reversed down that logging road so fast I shattered my passenger side mirror on a tree. I didn't stop until I reached La Ronge 3 hours later, my hands locked around the steering wheel so tight they cramped. The next day I called the lawyer and told him to sell the cabin. I didn't care what price. He asked if I'd spent the night there, and I lied and said yes. 2 weeks later, he called back and said something strange. A survey crew had gone out to assess the property, and they'd found long scratches on every window. Deep gouges that went right through the varnish on the exterior frames. He asked if I knew anything about that. I told him I didn't. I still have the photo I took of the sunset that first evening. I didn't notice it until months later, but if you zoom in on the tree line in the background, there's something pale standing between 2 spruces. It's blurred, like it moved right as I took the shot, but you can make out the shape of a hand raised to its face, or to where its face should be. I deleted the photo, but sometimes I still see it when I close my eyes. Those 2 long fingers, that white skin against the dark trees. Something watching from the forest that had been watching my uncle for 30 years. Story 2. I'd been working as a surveyor for 3 years when they sent me up to the Yukon. The job was straightforward: map out a section of Crown land near the Peel River watershed that might be opened for mineral exploration. I'd be out there for 5 days with a guide named Thomas, a local guy who'd grown up in Old Crow. He was about 50, didn't talk much, but he knew the terrain like it was his backyard. We flew in by float plane, got dropped at a lake with no name on any map I'd ever seen, and started hiking northeast into country that probably hadn't seen human footsteps in decades. The first 2 days were fine. Cold, obviously. This was early October, but clear skies and good visibility. We covered about 15 kilometers a day, and I'd set up the total station at predetermined waypoints while Thomas scouted ahead or made camp. He'd stop sometimes and just listen, head tilted like he was trying to hear something specific. When I asked what he was listening for, he just said animals and kept walking. On the 3rd day, we found the bones. We'd been following a game trail along a ridge when Thomas stopped so suddenly I almost walked into him. There was a caribou skeleton lying in the middle of the path, not scattered like you'd expect from predator kills, but arranged. The spine was laid out perfectly straight, ribs on either side in descending order, skull at one end, pelvis at the other. Even the leg bones were positioned parallel to each other. It looked like something a museum would display, except we were 40 kilometers from the nearest settlement. Thomas crouched down and didn't touch anything. He studied it for maybe 2 minutes, then stood up and said we should make camp early. It was barely 3 o'clock. I asked why, and he said he didn't want to be walking when it got dark. The way he said it made my stomach feel cold. I wanted to ask what he meant, but something about his expression told me he wouldn't answer. We set up the tent in a small clearing about half a kilometer from the bones. Thomas built a fire bigger than necessary. I remember thinking we were wasting fuel. He sat facing north, away from the tent, and he didn't eat much dinner. I tried to make conversation, asked him about his family, about Old Crow, about whether he'd seen arrangements like that before. He finally looked at me and said, "You should sleep in the tent tonight. Don't come out unless I call for you. And if you hear me talking, but I'm not calling your name, stay inside." I laughed because I thought he was joking. He didn't laugh back. I woke up around 2 in the morning because Thomas was talking. His voice was low, coming from somewhere outside the tent. I couldn't make out the words at first. It sounded like he was having a conversation with someone, pausing like he was listening to responses. My first thought was that another surveyor team had stumbled across our camp, though that seemed unlikely. I unzipped the tent flap just enough to see out. Thomas was standing at the edge of the clearing, his back to me, facing the tree line. He was speaking in a language I didn't recognize, something with harsh consonants, not English or any of the Gwich'in phrases I'd heard him use, and something was speaking back to him. The voice came from the darkness between the trees, and it sounded like Thomas. Exactly like Thomas. Same pitch, same rhythm, but the words were wrong, like it was mimicking his voice without understanding what the sounds meant. I watched Thomas take 3 steps backward toward the fire. The voice from the trees got louder, more insistent. And then I saw movement, something pale shifting between the spruce trunks, roughly man-shaped but wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. It was too tall or too thin or moved in a way that didn't match what I was seeing. My eyes couldn't hold on to it. Thomas said something sharp in that harsh language and the voice stopped. The shape in the trees went still. We stayed like that, Thomas standing rigid by the fire, me frozen in the tent opening, that thing motionless in the darkness for what felt like an hour but was probably only minutes. Then Thomas backed up until he was at the tent, reached down without looking and grabbed my shoulder through the fabric. "Close it," he whispered. "Don't open it again." I zipped the flap shut and lay there in my sleeping bag, listening to Thomas move around the camp. I heard him feeding the fire, heard wood cracking in the flames. I heard that voice from the trees one more time, calling out something that might have been words. Thomas didn't respond. Eventually, I fell back asleep, though I don't know how. In the morning, Thomas was already packing up when I emerged. He looked like he hadn't slept. We didn't talk about what happened. We didn't talk about much of anything. We finished the survey work in one long, exhausting push and hiked back to the lake in near silence. The float plane picked us up on schedule. It wasn't until we were back in Whitehorse that Thomas said anything about that night. We were parting ways at the airport, and he turned to me and said, "It was testing you, seeing if you'd come out. It knows your voice now, so if you ever come back up here and you hear someone calling your name in the bush, you keep walking. You understand?" I told him I understood, though I didn't really. I still don't. But last year I was on a job in northern BC and I made camp alone near a frozen creek. Around midnight I woke up to someone calling my name from the trees. It sounded exactly like Thomas, same cadence, same accent. I lay in my tent and didn't answer. The voice called 3 more times, getting closer each time, and then it stopped. In the morning, I found a single set of tracks circling my tent. The prints were barefoot, pressed deep into the snow. Human-shaped, but each toe was too long, and there were only 4 of them. Story 3. Growing up in Atlin, British Columbia, you get used to the idea that the wilderness is always bigger than you. The town sits on the edge of this massive lake with mountains pushing up on all sides, and beyond those mountains is just more wilderness, thousands of kilometers of it stretching north into the Yukon. My dad used to say that Atlin was as close as you could get to the edge of the world without falling off. When I was 17, my friend Kirsten and I decided we were going to hike to Llewellyn Glacier. It's about 30 kilometers from town, and neither of us had ever been that far into the backcountry alone. My parents weren't thrilled, but they taught me basic survival skills since I was old enough to walk, and Kirsten's uncle gave us his satellite phone just in case. We set out on a Friday morning in late August, planning to camp one night and come back Saturday. The hike was beautiful at first. We followed an old mining trail that wound through valleys full of fireweed and lupin, with creeks so clear you could see every stone on the bottom. Kirsten kept stopping to take photos. She wanted to be a photographer back then. We were making good time, joking around, not really paying attention to how far we'd come. Around 3 in the afternoon, Kirsten realized we'd missed a turn somewhere. The trail had just sort of disappeared, and we were in this dense forest of lodgepole pine with no clear sight lines. I pulled out the map and we tried to figure out where we'd gone wrong. That's when Kirsten pointed to something carved into a tree about 10 meters off to our left. It was a symbol, 3 wavy lines stacked on top of each other, cut deep into the bark. The wood inside the cuts was old and gray, meaning someone had carved it years ago. Below the symbol, there was a single word in blocky letters, "Turn back." Kirsten wanted to keep going. She said it was probably just some local trying to keep people away from a hunting spot. I wasn't so sure, but I didn't want to be the one to suggest we turn around. We were both stubborn that way, so we kept walking, using my compass to head generally north, figuring we'd hit the glacier eventually or at least intersect with the trail again. We found 2 more carvings over the next hour. Same symbol, same warning. The third one had something else too, a small pile of stones stacked at the base of the tree. Cairns are common out here, but something about this one felt wrong. The stones were all the same size, 2 perfectly arranged, and each one had a small hole drilled through the center. I touched the top stone without thinking, and it was cold, far colder than it should have been, even in the shade. Kirsten said we should set up camp. The sun would be down in a few hours, and we'd made enough mistakes for one day. We found a clearing near a creek and got the tent up, started a fire, boiled water for our dehydrated meals. Normal camping stuff, except the woods around us were completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, not even wind in the trees, just the sound of the creek and our own voices. When it got dark, the silence got heavier. That's the only way I can describe it, like the quiet was pressing down on us. Kirsten noticed it too. We sat by the fire and didn't talk much, just fed sticks into the flames and tried to pretend everything was fine. Around 10 o'clock we heard whistling. It was coming from somewhere east of our camp, a simple tune like something you'd make up while walking. 3 notes up, 2 notes down. It repeated 4 times, then stopped. Kirsten called out, "Hello," and I wanted to smack her. The whistling started again, same tune but closer. I could tell it was moving through the trees in a wide arc around our camp. It never stopped moving. We let the fire burn down to coals and got in the tent. I had my knife on me, though I don't know what good I thought it would do. We lay there listening to the whistling circle us, sometimes close enough that it seemed like it was just outside the tent, sometimes farther away but still audible. The tune never changed. Kirsten grabbed my hand at some point, and I could feel her pulse in her wrist, too fast. The whistling stopped around midnight. I was starting to breathe normally again when we heard the footsteps. They were heavy, deliberate, crunching through the undergrowth. Whatever was making them wasn't trying to be quiet. The steps came right up to the tent and stopped. Kirsten had the flashlight and she started to reach for it. I grabbed her arm and shook my head. We lay there in complete darkness, listening to something breathing on the other side of the nylon. The breathing was wrong. It was too slow, too measured, like someone taking deliberate breaths just to let us know they were there. After maybe 5 minutes, the footsteps moved away. They circled the tent twice. I could track them by sound and then headed toward the fire pit. We heard stones being moved, the clatter of rocks against each other. Then silence again. Neither of us slept. We lay there until dawn, and the second there was enough light to see, we packed up and got the hell out of that clearing. The fire pit was completely dismantled, every stone removed and stacked in a pile. Right next to it was the symbol from the trees, drawn in the dirt with perfect precision. We didn't talk, we just hiked south as fast as we could until we found the main trail. We made it back to Atlin by early afternoon. My dad took one look at us and asked what happened. I couldn't really explain it. I told him we got lost and spooked ourselves. He seemed to accept that, but a few days later, he mentioned that an old prospector named Douglas had disappeared in that area back in the 1970s. They found his camp torn apart, all his gear scattered, but no body. The only thing they found was a cairn made of stones with holes drilled through them. Nobody could explain why he'd made it or what the holes were for. Kirsten moved to Vancouver for university the next year, and we don't talk much anymore. But last time I saw her at Christmas, she asked if I still had the photos from that trip. I said no, though that was a lie. I have them on my old camera, and I've looked at them more times than I should. In one of the shots Kirsten took of me near the fire, there's something behind me at the edge of the frame. It's just a blur, but you can make out what looks like a head and shoulders. No face. Just a smooth, pale oval where a face should be. I've never shown anyone that photo. I don't think I ever will. Story 4. The fishing lodge my brother Garrett worked at was closing for the season. This was on Great Slave Lake, about 60 kilometers from Yellowknife, and Garrett was the last staff member scheduled to winterize the place, drain the pipes, board up the windows, that kind of thing. He called me 3 days before he was supposed to start and asked if I wanted to come help. Said he'd split his paycheck with me, and we'd basically have the whole lodge to ourselves. I'd been out of work for 2 months, so I said yes without really thinking about it. The lodge was bigger than I expected. Main building with a commercial kitchen and dining hall, 6 guest cabins scattered around the property, a boathouse on the water. Garrett and I arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, and the owners had already left. They'd taken the vehicles, so we were there with just a 4-wheeler and a satellite phone that barely worked. The place felt abandoned in a way that went beyond just closed for winter, like it was already halfway to being forgotten. We spent the first day working on the main building. I was in the kitchen draining the water heater while Garrett checked the propane lines. Around 4 o'clock, he came in and said he'd found something weird in cabin 3. I followed him out there. It was the furthest cabin from the main building, tucked back in the trees. The door was unlocked, and inside was clean except for the bed. Someone had stripped all the linens off and piled them in the center of the mattress. On top of the pile was a hunting knife, blade down, driven into the mattress so hard the tip had gone through to the box spring. Garrett pulled the knife out and looked at me like I should have an explanation. I didn't. We checked the logbook in the main building. The last guest in cabin 3 had checked out in mid-September, almost 3 weeks ago. The note said everything was normal. I figured maybe some maintenance guy had left the knife there and forgot about it, though that didn't really make sense. We threw the linens in the trash and kept working. That night we slept in the main building, Garrett in one of the staff rooms, me on a couch in the office. I woke up around 3 in the morning because I heard voices outside. Not shouting, just conversation, like 2 people talking casually while walking past the building. I looked out the window and couldn't see anyone. The property was dark except for the motion light by the boathouse, and that wasn't on. I figured I'd been dreaming and went back to sleep. In the morning, Garrett asked if I'd been outside during the night. I said no. He showed me boot prints in the frost, 2 sets, walking from the direction of the cabins toward the lake. They stopped at the water's edge and just ended. No prints coming back. We followed them to make sure, and Garrett kept saying maybe someone had been canoeing and stopped for some reason, though that didn't explain why their tracks only went one direction. The rest of that day felt off. We were working on cabin 5, replacing broken boards on the porch when I saw movement in the tree line, just a flicker of something pale gone before I could focus on it. I didn't mention it to Garrett. Around dinner time, we were in the kitchen heating up canned stew, and the lights went out. The backup generator kicked in after a few seconds, but in that gap of darkness, I heard something tap against the kitchen window. 3 taps, evenly spaced. When the lights came back on, there was a handprint on the glass. Small, like a child's hand, but the fingers were too long and the palm was narrow. Garrett saw it too. Neither of us said anything. He just went and locked the front door. We decided to sleep in the same room that night, the staff room Garrett had been using. We didn't talk about why. Around midnight, we heard footsteps on the roof, not like an animal, but deliberate footfalls pacing back and forth above us. Garrett whispered that it was probably a lynx, even though we both knew it was. The pacing went on for maybe 20 minutes, then stopped directly above where we were lying. We could hear breathing through the roof vent, deep, wet breaths that fogged in the cold air coming through the duct. I wanted to leave right then. Just take the four-wheeler and drive to the highway, flag down a truck, get out of there. But it was 60 kilometers through wilderness in the dark, and neither of us was sure we could make it. So we stayed in that room with our backs against the wall, waiting for morning. The breathing stopped around dawn. We didn't waste time. We threw our stuff in bags and went straight for the four-wheeler. That's when we saw cabin 3. The door was wide open, hanging crooked on its hinges like someone had ripped it off and tried to put it back. Inside, all the furniture was flipped over. The mattress had been torn apart, stuffing everywhere, and on the wall above the bed, someone had drawn the same symbol over and over, a circle with 3 lines radiating out from the center. They'd drawn it in something dark and sticky that might have been mud but didn't smell like mud. Garrett grabbed my arm and we ran for the four-wheeler. It started on the first try and we took off down the access road so fast I thought we'd flip on one of the turns. We made it to the highway and flagged down a timber truck. The driver took us into Yellowknife and we called the lodge owners from a motel. Garrett told them there'd been vandalism at the property and he couldn't finish the winterizing. They were pissed, but they didn't argue. 2 weeks later, the owners sent someone else to finish the job. Garrett got a call from them saying cabin 3 had burned down. Electrical fire, they thought, though there wasn't any electricity running to the cabins. They also said they found something strange in the ashes, small bones arranged in patterns on the floor, like someone had been building something before the fire. The bones weren't animal bones. They were too smooth, too uniformly shaped. Fish and Wildlife came out to investigate, but I don't think they ever figured out what they were. Garrett quit the tourism industry after that. He works construction in Edmonton now and won't talk about that lodge. But sometimes when we're on the phone, I'll ask him if he remembers the breathing sound from the roof vent, and he'll go quiet for a long time before he changes the subject. I think about those boot prints ending at the water, about the handprint on the window with fingers too long, about the breathing that came through the walls. And I think about the knife in cabin 3, driven into the mattress like someone had been trying to pin something down. Like maybe it hadn't worked. Story 5. My girlfriend Simone and I rented a cabin near Lake Louise for a week in February. We'd been together for about 1.5 years, and things were getting serious. The kind of serious where you talk about moving in together, about the future. She worked insane hours as a nurse, and I was managing a warehouse in Calgary, so we barely saw each other. This trip was supposed to be our reset. Just us, snow, maybe some skiing if we felt like it. The cabin was about 15 kilometers outside the main resort area, down a private road that wasn't on Google Maps. The listing said it had been in the owner's family since the 1960s. Rustic charm, the photos promised. What they didn't show was how isolated it actually was. The nearest neighbor was at least 3 kilometers away, and you couldn't see any other buildings from the property. Just mountains and trees and the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. We got there late afternoon on a Sunday. The cabin was nice enough. Knotty pine walls, a stone fireplace, loft bedroom. Simone loved it immediately. She started unpacking and planning meals while I brought in firewood and figured out how the water heater worked. The owner had left a binder on the kitchen counter with instructions for everything, plus some notes about wildlife in the area. Black bears, elk, coyotes, standard stuff. On the last page, there was a handwritten note that said, "If you hear knocking after dark, do not respond. Do not open doors or windows. This is important." I showed Simone and we laughed about it. We figured it was either someone's idea of a joke or maybe a reference to some local superstition. There's always weird folklore in mountain towns. We made dinner, Simon's pasta thing with way too much garlic, and opened a bottle of wine. It was maybe the most relaxed I'd felt in months. Around 9 o'clock, we heard knocking. 3 solid thumps on the front door, like someone hitting it with the flat of their hand. Simone looked at me, and I could tell she was thinking about the note in the binder. I got up and walked toward the door, and she grabbed my wrist. "Maybe don't," she said. I told her it was probably just a neighbor or someone lost on the road. But when I looked through the peephole, there was no one there. The porch light was on, and I could see all the way to the tree line. Nothing. The knocking came again, same rhythm from the back door this time. We had a small mudroom off the kitchen with a door that led to a woodshed. I went back there and looked through the window. Empty. I opened the door a crack and called out, "Hello!" The cold air that rushed in smelled wrong, not like snow or pine, but something organic and rot, like wet fur left in the sun. I shut the door fast and locked it. Simon wanted to call the owner. I got out the satellite phone. There was no cell service and tried 3 times, but it just rang and rang. We decided to ignore it. We went upstairs to the loft and pretended to watch a movie on Simon's laptop, but we were both listening. Around 11, the knocking started again. This time it came from the windows. First the one facing the driveway, then the one over the kitchen sink, then the small window in the bathroom. Each time it was 3 knocks, perfectly spaced. Each time when we looked, there was nothing there. Simon was starting to freak out. I tried to stay calm, tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was ice falling from the roof. Maybe it was branches. But ice doesn't knock in sets of 3, and there were no branches close enough to touch the windows. Around 1 in the morning, the knocking stopped. We lay in bed not sleeping, just waiting for it to start again. Instead, we heard breathing. It was coming from somewhere below us in the main room. Long, steady breaths, like someone resting after physical exertion. I grabbed the flashlight and climbed down from the loft. Simon whispered for me to stop, but I couldn't just lie there. The breathing was coming from right in front of the fireplace. I shone the light at the hearth, and there was nothing, but the breathing didn't stop. It moved. I could track it by sound, from the fireplace to the kitchen, then to the base of the loft ladder. I climbed back up so fast I almost dropped the flashlight. Simone and I pulled the blankets over us like that would help, like we were kids hiding from something in the closet. The breathing stayed at the bottom of the ladder for the rest of the night. We could hear it, slow and rhythmic, impossibly patient. When dawn came and light started filtering through the windows, it stopped. We packed in silence and left without eating breakfast. I didn't care about losing the deposit. We just wanted out. On the drive back to Calgary, Simone found something in her coat pocket. A small piece of bone, smooth and white, about the size of a guitar pick. She'd never seen it before. It wasn't hers. We threw it out the window somewhere on the Trans-Canada Highway, and neither of us spoke for the next 2 hours. I called the owner a week later and asked about the note in the binder. He was quiet for a long time, then said his grandfather had built the cabin in 1962, and the note had been in the binder since then. His grandfather had been a trapper, and he told the family that something lived in those woods that didn't like visitors, something that would test you to see if you'd let it in. The owner said no one had ever been hurt at the cabin, but he kept the note there because his grandfather had made him promise. Simone and I broke up 3 months later. It wasn't related to the cabin, at least not directly, but things felt different after that trip. Like we'd seen something together that we couldn't unsee, and it changed the way we looked at each other. I haven't been back to the mountains since. Sometimes I wake up at night and think I hear breathing at the foot of my bed, 3 long, measured breaths, and then silence. I turn on the light and there's nothing there, but I can still feel it, the weight of something watching, waiting to see if I'll respond. Story 6. The ice road to Tuktoyaktuk opens in January when the Mackenzie River freezes solid enough to support vehicles. I was driving a supply truck up there for a drilling company, hauling equipment and fuel for a site about 80 kilometers past Tuck. This was my third winter doing the run, so I knew the route, knew the ice conditions, knew which spots could get sketchy if the temperature fluctuated. It's good money, but you have to respect the environment. The ice gives you signals, cracks, pressure ridges, color changes. You learn to read them, and if you don't last long. I left in Uvik around 4 in the morning. The sun wouldn't rise for another few hours, which was normal for mid-January that far north. The truck was loaded heavy, about 18 tons, and I was making decent time. The radio kept me company, switching between CBC and some station out of Whitehorse that played old country music. Around 50 kilometers in, the radio started cutting out. Just static, then brief bursts of sound, then static again. I figured it was the terrain or maybe atmospheric conditions. You get that up here sometimes. At the 60-kilometer mark, I saw the truck. It was pulled off to the side of the ice road, hazards on, no visible damage. I slowed down and pulled alongside. Nobody was in the cab. I sat there for a minute trying to decide what to do. You don't just leave someone stranded on the ice road, especially in winter, but something about the scene felt off. The engine was running. I could see exhaust coming from the stack, and the driver's door was open, swinging slightly in the wind, but there were no tracks in the snow around the truck, no footprints, nothing. I grabbed my flashlight and got out. The cold hit me like a physical thing. It had to be -40 at least. I walked over to the truck and shone my light inside the cab. The driver's seat was empty. Keys still in the ignition, thermos of coffee sitting in the cup holder. Steam was coming off the coffee. Whoever had been driving, they'd left recently. I called out, my voice getting swallowed by the wind. No response. That's when I noticed the tracks on the ice itself. Not footprints, but drag marks, 2 parallel lines leading away from the truck and heading north, off the road into the pressure ridge field. The lines were deep, like someone or something heavy had been pulled across the ice. I followed them for maybe 20 meters, and then they just stopped. The ice beyond was smooth, undisturbed. Whatever had made the marks had either flown away or vanished. I should have called it in right then, should have radioed for help and waited in my truck, but I was young and stupid, and part of me was curious. I kept walking, following the general direction the drag marks had been going. The pressure ridges got taller, slabs of ice pushed up at weird angles, some of them 3 or 4 meters high. It was like walking through a frozen maze. My flashlight beam couldn't penetrate more than a few meters ahead. I heard singing. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the ridge field, a woman's voice singing something in a language I didn't recognize. The melody was simple, almost like a lullaby. I stopped walking and tried to pinpoint where it was coming from, but the ice walls around me were reflecting the sound, making it seem like it was everywhere at once. I called out again, asked if someone needed help. The singing stopped. Something moved behind me. I spun around and saw a figure standing about 15 meters back, silhouetted against my truck's headlights. It was tall, taller than any person I'd ever seen, and it stood perfectly still. I couldn't make out any details. The light was behind it, creating a halo effect, but I could see the shape of its head tilted to one side like it was studying me. I raised my flashlight and the beam caught it full on. It didn't have a face. Where the face should have been, there was just smooth, pale ice, slightly translucent, with darker shapes moving underneath like muscles or tendons. The body was human-shaped but wrong, joints bending at angles that didn't make sense, fingers too long and tipped with something black. It raised one hand toward me, palm out, and took a step forward. I ran. I don't remember making the decision, my body just moved. I crashed through the pressure ridges, sliding on ice, banging my shin on a ledge, not caring. I could hear footsteps behind me, faster than I was moving, closing the distance. I burst out onto the road and sprinted for my truck. The driver's door was still open. I dove inside, slammed the door, locked it. I looked in the side mirror and saw the thing standing at the edge of the road, half in shadow. It watched me for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Then it turned and walked back into the pressure ridges. I drove the rest of the way to the drill site without stopping. When I got there, I told the supervisor what I'd seen. He said there'd been reports on the radio. The abandoned truck I'd found belonged to a driver named Peter Olson. He'd left Tuck 6 hours before me and should have reached the site before sunrise. They found his truck exactly where I'd described, engine still running, coffee still warm. They never found Peter. Search crews combed the area for 3 days and turned up nothing. No tracks, no signs of struggle, no body. I quit the ice road work after that season. I told people it was because the pay wasn't worth the risk, but that wasn't really it. I couldn't shake the image of that thing standing in the headlights, its faceless head tilted toward me, its 2 long fingers spread wide like it was offering me something. Sometimes I still hear that singing, usually when I'm falling asleep, just on the edge of consciousness. A woman's voice, soft and cold as ice, singing a song I don't know the words to. And I wonder if Peter Olson heard it too, right before he stepped out of his truck and walked into the ridges, leaving no footprints behind. Story 7. I was 19 the summer I got a job planting trees in northern Manitoba. The crew was small, about 15 of us, mostly students trying to make money before fall semester. We lived in a camp that moved every 2 weeks, following the cut blocks where logging companies had cleared the forest. The work was brutal. You'd plant anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 seedlings a day, bent over for 10 hours, bugs swarming, rain or shine. But the pay was decent, and I liked being outdoors. Our foreman was a guy named Barry who'd been planting for 20 years. He had rules. Don't wander away from your grid. Don't plant after dark. If you get lost, stay put and blow your whistle. And if you find slash piles that look deliberately stacked, mark them and move on. That last one seemed oddly specific, and when I asked him about it, he just said some areas had been logged in ways that weren't standard. I didn't push it. We'd been in this particular cut block for about a week when I found the clearing. I was planting along the eastern edge of my grid near a creek when I noticed the trees on the far side were still standing. Not just standing, but old-growth spruce, the kind that had been there for hundreds of years. The logging company had cut everything around them, but left this one circular patch untouched. It was maybe 50 meters across, perfectly round, like someone had drawn a line and said, "Don't go past this." I crossed the creek to get a better look. The moment I stepped into the tree line, the air changed. It got colder and the light seemed dimmer even though the sun was still up. The ground was covered in moss so thick it felt like walking on foam. In the center of the clearing was a slash pile, logs stacked in a tight spiral, each piece cut to exactly the same length. On top of the pile was a caribou skull, antlers still attached, arranged so it faced east. I should have left. Barry's rule echoed in my head, but I was curious and I was 19 and curiosity won. I walked closer and saw that the logs had markings on them, symbols carved into the bark, circles with dots in the center, X shapes, lines that intersected at odd angles. They reminded me of pictographs I'd seen in museums, but rougher, more recent. I took out my phone to snap a photo, and that's when I noticed my battery was dead. It had been at 70% 10 minutes ago. Something crunched behind me. I turned and saw a man standing at the edge of the clearing. He was older, maybe 60, wearing clothes that looked like they'd been patched 100 times. His face was deeply tanned and lined with wrinkles, and his eyes were the palest blue I'd ever seen. He didn't say anything, just stood there watching me. I said hello. He didn't respond. I asked if he worked for the logging company, if he knew what the clearing was for. He tilted his head slightly, like he was considering whether to answer. Then he said, in a voice that sounded like gravel, "You should go back to your trees. Don't come here again." I asked why, and he said, "Because it's been watching you since you stepped over the creek." The way he said it made my skin prickle. I looked around the clearing but didn't see anything. When I turned back to the man, he was gone. I hadn't heard him leave. There was no sound of branches breaking, no footsteps. He just vanished. I got out of there fast, splashing back through the creek and returning to my grid. I didn't mention it to anyone that night. The next day, I went back to plant the same section. The clearing was still there, but the slash pile was different. The logs had been rearranged. Instead of a spiral, they were now stacked in parallel lines like railroad ties. The caribou skull was gone. In its place was a small pile of teeth. Human teeth, I was pretty sure, about a dozen of them. They were clean, almost white, arranged in a neat circle. I reported it to Bari. He went pale when I described the clearing, and he radioed the logging company's supervisor. They sent someone out to look, and I took them to the spot. When we got there, the clearing was empty. No slash pile, no teeth, no symbols on the trees, just moss and old spruce. The guy from the logging company said I must have been confused, that I'd found a different spot, but I knew I hadn't. The creek was right there. The trees were the same. The clearing had been erased. Bari pulled me aside that evening and told me not to talk about it with the rest of the crew. He said there were places in the bush that didn't follow normal rules, and if you bothered them, they bothered you back. He'd seen it before, people who went into certain areas and came back different or didn't come back at all. The logging companies knew about these places and they left them alone. The slash piles were markers, warnings. I'd crossed one without realizing it. I finished the summer, but I kept finding things in my gear that didn't belong to me. A smooth black stone in my boot, a small braid of grass on my pillow, a strip of birch bark folded into my backpack. Each time I'd throw the object away, but it would reappear in a different spot. The other planters started noticing too. They said I smelled like smoke even though I didn't build fires. They said I looked sick even though I felt fine. When the season ended, I went home to Winnipeg and tried to forget about it, but the things kept appearing. I'd find stones in my pockets, teeth on my nightstand, braids of dead grass in my drawers. It went on for months until I finally drove back to that cut block in November. I hiked to where the clearing had been and left an offering, a bottle of vodka and a pack of cigarettes, things Bari had said were traditional. I said I was sorry, that I didn't mean to trespass. I said I'd never come back. The things stopped appearing after that. But sometimes, usually in winter when the nights are longest, I dream about the clearing. In the dream, I'm standing in the center of the slash pile, and the old man with pale blue eyes is circling me, chanting in a language I don't understand. He chants until the sun comes up, and when I wake, I can still feel the cold moss under my feet, can still smell the smoke that wasn't there. And I know that whatever was watching me from those trees is still watching, waiting to see if I'll break my promise and go back. Story 8. My sister Danielle and I inherited a hunting cabin near Churchill after our uncle died. Neither of us had hunted a day in our lives, but the cabin was worth something, and we figured we'd check it out before deciding whether to sell. The drive from Winnipeg took 2 days, and by the time we arrived in Churchill, we were exhausted and barely speaking. Danielle had been on my case the whole trip about bringing more supplies, about how I never planned ahead. I told her we'd be fine. There was a town 20 minutes away. The cabin was further out than we'd thought. The dirt road from Churchill was barely maintained, and we had to stop 3 times to clear fallen trees. When we finally pulled up to the property, it was almost dusk. The cabin was small, just 2 rooms and an outhouse, but solidly built. Our uncle had spent most of his autumns here, apparently, hunting caribou and geese. The walls were covered with old maps and photos of him with various animals. It smelled like wood smoke and mildew. We spent the first evening just cleaning and airing the place out. Danielle found a journal in one of the drawers, our uncle's handwriting, entries dating back about 15 years. Most of it was mundane stuff, weather reports, animal sightings, notes about repairs he'd made, but there were also entries that didn't fit the pattern. November 12th, heard the child again. Closer this time needs to stop. November 18th, left offerings at the edge of the property, hope it's enough. November 22nd, it knows I'm alone now. I showed the journal to Danielle and she said our uncle had probably been going senile. He'd been in his 70s when he died, and old men who lived alone tended to get paranoid. I wanted to believe that. We decided to stay 2 nights, long enough to inventory the property and take some photos for a real estate listing, and then head back to Winnipeg. That night we heard the child. It was maybe 10 o'clock and we were playing cards by lantern light. The crying came from somewhere outside, high-pitched and desperate, like a toddler who'd gotten lost. Danielle's face went white. She stood up and moved toward the door and I grabbed her arm. I said, "Don't." She asked why not, and I pointed to the journal entry. She said a kid could actually be lost out there and we couldn't just ignore it. We opened the door together. The crying had stopped. The property was dark except for the moon, which was nearly full, casting everything in blue-white light. We could see all the way to the tree line, maybe 50 meters. There was no child, no movement at all. Danielle called out, "Hello, is someone there?" The crying started again, but this time it came from behind the cabin. We walked around to the back and it stopped again. Danielle said we should get flashlights and search the area. I told her we should go back inside and lock the door. We compromised by standing on the porch with a flashlight, sweeping the beam across the property. The crying moved. It circled the cabin, never staying in one place for more than a few seconds. Each time we pointed the light toward it, it would stop, and when we moved the light away, it would start again from a different direction. After about 10 minutes of this, Danielle said, "That's not a child." I knew she was right, but I didn't want to say it out loud. We went inside and barricaded the door with a chair. The crying continued all night. Sometimes it sounded like it was right outside the walls, close enough that we should have been able to see breath fogging the windows, but there was never anything there. Around 3 in the morning, the crying changed. It turned into laughter, the high, breathless laughter of a child who'd been tickled. It was the worst sound I'd ever heard. Danielle was reading through more of the journal by flashlight. She found an entry from 5 years ago. It mimics what it hears. I made the mistake of playing my grandson's voice on a recording. Now it uses his voice at night. I can't make it stop. I've tried everything. She looked at me and asked if our uncle had a grandson. I said yes, our cousin Jeremy's son, who would have been about 2 or 3 at that time. Danielle started crying quietly. The laughter stopped at dawn. We packed immediately, didn't bother with breakfast or inventorying anything. We just wanted out. As we were loading the car, I noticed something at the tree line. A small figure standing between 2 spruces about 3 feet tall, pale, watching us. I pointed it out to Danielle. She saw it too. We stared for maybe 30 seconds and then it moved. It didn't walk or run, it just shifted positions like a video skipping frames. One moment it was at the tree line, the next it was 10 meters closer, then 20. Each time it moved, it didn't cross the space between. It just appeared. We got in the car and drove. I watched the rearview mirror the entire way down the dirt road, expecting to see that pale figure standing in the middle of the path. We made it to Churchill and sold the cabin to the first buyer who made an offer. Didn't even negotiate. I've never asked Danielle if she still thinks about that night. I'm afraid of what she might say. About 6 months later, I got a call from the new owner. He wanted to know if we had any information about the property's history. Apparently, he'd been hearing a child crying at night, and he'd found something strange in the woods behind the cabin, a circle of stones with small bones arranged inside. He asked if our uncle had been into anything spiritual or occult. I told him I didn't know and hung up. He called twice more, but I didn't answer. The last voicemail he left said he was moving out and wanted to know if we'd take the cabin back. We didn't respond. I still have our uncle's journal. Sometimes I flip through it, reading the entries that got progressively more desperate. The last entry, dated 3 days before he died, says, "I think I understand now. It doesn't want offerings, it wants company. I'm too old to keep saying no." I don't know what that means. I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night when I'm falling asleep, I hear the laughter of a child who's never been tickled, who's never played, who's only learned to mimic the sounds of joy without understanding them. And I'm grateful our uncle never let it inside. Story 9. The mine closed in 1987. I only know that because of the faded sign we found half buried in snow. Mackenzie Silver Mine, S. 1952, closed by order 1987. We'd been snowshoeing for about 3 hours, heading northwest from Fort Smith into the backcountry, when we stumbled onto the site. My friend Jonah and I were both into urban exploration back then, abandoned buildings, old industrial sites, that kind of thing. We'd heard rumors about mining operations in the Northwest Territories that had been shut down suddenly, and Jonah convinced me that finding one would make for a great video series. We were 23 and thought we were invincible. The mine entrance was a horizontal shaft cut into the side of a low hill with timber supports that were mostly rotted. There were several outbuildings nearby, what looked like an office, a bunkhouse, and some kind of processing facility. All the windows were broken and snow had drifted inside, creating these weird frozen dunes on the floors. Jonah started filming immediately. He had this handheld camera with a light attachment, and he was walking around narrating like we were on some nature documentary. I was more interested in the mine itself. The entrance shaft was partially collapsed, but there was still a gap large enough to squeeze through. I called Jonah over, and we stood there debating whether to go inside. The timber supports looked unstable, and neither of us had any mining experience. But we'd come all this way, and the idea of getting footage from inside an abandoned mine was too tempting. We decided to go in just far enough to see what was there, 20 meters, maybe 30. The shaft sloped downward at about a 15-degree angle. Our headlamps illuminated wooden beams, rusted rail tracks for ore carts, and walls of dark rock that glittered with some kind of mineral. It was cold, but not as cold as outside. The air smelled like damp stone and something else I couldn't identify, something organic. About 10 meters in, we found the first boot. It was sitting in the middle of the tracks, old leather, half-rotted, just one boot, no pair. Jonah filmed it and made some joke about Cinderella. I didn't laugh. We kept going. At the 20-meter mark, the shaft opened into a larger chamber, maybe 5 meters wide and 3 meters high. There were several tunnels branching off, and in the center of the chamber was a pile of equipment. Helmets, lanterns, tools, all arranged in a neat stack like someone had been organizing them. On top of the stack was another boot. This one looked newer, less decayed. Jonah reached out to touch it, and I told him to leave it alone. He asked why, and I said I didn't know. I just had a feeling. That's when we heard the scraping sound. It came from one of the side tunnels, a rhythmic dragging noise like something heavy being pulled across stone. We froze. Jonah lowered his camera. The scraping stopped, and in the silence we heard breathing. Deep, labored breaths echoing from the darkness. I grabbed Jonah's arm and whispered that we should leave. He nodded. We turned to head back toward the entrance, and that's when we saw the lights. They were coming from deeper in the mine, from one of the other tunnels. Small yellow lights bobbing in the darkness like flashlights or lanterns. There were 3 of them moving in a line, getting closer. Jonah started backing up, and I pulled him toward the entrance shaft. The lights kept coming. We could hear footsteps now, heavy and deliberate, accompanied by that scraping sound. We ran. I don't remember making it back through the entrance gap, but suddenly we were outside in the snow, gasping for air. Jonah dropped his camera, and I yanked him to his feet. We grabbed our snowshoes and got the hell out of there, not bothering to strap them on properly. We just stumbled through the snow, falling every few steps until we were far enough away that we couldn't see the mine buildings anymore. It wasn't until we stopped to catch our breath that Jonah realized he'd left his camera behind. He wanted to go back for it. The footage was on there, and the camera was expensive. I told him absolutely not. We argued for maybe 5 minutes before he finally agreed to keep moving. We made it back to Fort Smith well after dark, exhausted and hypothermic. I had frostbite on 3 toes. The next day, Jonah was still obsessing about the camera. He said he was going to hike back and get it, with or without me. I told him he was insane, but he wasn't listening. I ended up calling his dad, who talked him down and said he'd buy Jonah a new camera if he promised not to go back. Jonah reluctantly agreed. About a week later, we got a call from the RCMP. They said a hiker had found a camera near an old mine site and traced it back to Jonah through the registration. They asked if we'd been out there, if we'd seen anything unusual. Jonah admitted we'd gone into the mine. The officer was quiet for a long time, then said the mine had been sealed in 1987 after 3 workers disappeared during a shift. Their bodies were never found. The company claimed there'd been a collapse, but the investigation found no evidence of structural failure. The mine was closed and the site was supposed to be sealed. He asked us to describe what we'd seen inside. Jonah told them about the boots, the equipment pile, the lights. The officer asked him to repeat the part about the lights. Jonah described them, 3 yellow lights moving in a line. The officer said that matched the descriptions from the original investigation. Workers who'd been in the mine the day before the disappearance reported seeing lights in tunnels that weren't being used, hearing footsteps in sections that were supposed to be empty. The investigation wrote it off as paranoia or equipment malfunction, but after the 3 men vanished, nobody wanted to go back down. The officer said we were lucky we got out. He said there'd been other incidents over the years, hikers who'd explored the mine and reported similar experiences. One guy claimed something had followed him out, that he'd heard footsteps behind him all the way to his truck. The RCMP couldn't explain it, and they'd officially marked the site as hazardous. They were planning to seal the entrance permanently. I asked if they'd watched the footage on Jonah's camera. The officer said yes, and then he got quiet again. He said the last minute of video showed Jonah and me running toward the entrance, but in the background, visible in the camera's light, there were figures standing in the chamber. 3 of them wearing mining helmets and coveralls, perfectly still. Their faces were turned toward the camera, but where their features should have been, there was just shadow. The officer said the footage was being kept as evidence, but he strongly suggested we not ask to see it. Jonah and I don't talk much anymore. He moved to Vancouver, got married, has a normal life. But once, about 2 years ago, he called me drunk at midnight. He said he'd been having the same dream for weeks. He was back in that mine, walking deeper and deeper into the tunnels, and behind him he could hear 3 sets of footsteps matching his pace. He'd wake up and find dirt under his fingernails, even though he hadn't been anywhere near soil. He asked if I ever had dreams like that. I lied and said no. But I do. In my dreams, I'm standing in the center of that chamber, and the lights are coming toward me from all directions. I can't move. I can't run. I just stand there while the footsteps get closer, while the scraping sound echoes off the walls, while something that used to be human reaches out with hands that feel like cold stone and says, in a voice like gravel sliding, "Stay! Work to do, always work to do." I wake up before they touch me, but sometimes I can still feel the cold of that mine in my bones, like part of me never really left. Like I'm still down there in the dark, waiting to become the 4th light. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed these stories, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Let me know in the comments which story unsettled you most, and share this with your friends who love a good scare. Until next time, stay safe out there.